All right, and I'm going to start letting people in.
Sounds good.
Okay. All right, welcome, folks. I'm just going to give it 20 seconds for everyone to trickle in, and then we'll jump right in. All right. Well, hi, everyone, and welcome to our 6th episode of Data Talks, which is a free series of 45-minute webinars about using local data to inform housing policy. My name is Claudia Aiken. I'm Director of New Research Partnerships at the Housing Solutions Lab, and this episode is actually a special collaboration with Unlock NYC. And so I'm delighted to introduce Ashley Eberhart, Head of Product, and Manon Vergerio, Head of Data and Advocacy. And they will be speaking with us about landlord discrimination data, and specifically Unlock NYC's unique and innovative approach to crowdsourcing data about source of income discrimination against housing voucher holders. And they will explain all that. So I'm just going to start it off with a very quick introduction to the Housing Solutions Lab and this series. Manon and Ashley will then lead us through a brief presentation about Unlock NYC's model and how they harness their data, as well as their recent pilot in Buffalo, New York. And then I'll have a conversation with Ashley and Manon to learn more about these efforts. And finally, we will have 10 to 15 minutes for your questions. So please feel free to submit those via the Q&A function at any time during the session. We'll get to as many of them as we can. If you're not familiar with the lab, we are based at the NYU Furman Center, and our mission is to help small and mid-sized cities plan, launch, and evaluate housing policies with the goal of advancing racial equity and health and well-being. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you'll take the opportunity to view past episodes on our website and also register for upcoming ones. Each of these sessions will be short. It will feature a fireside chat with someone like Ashley or Manon who has direct experience on the ground, and will post recommended reading as well. I will drop the link to all this in the chat shortly, but for now, let me go ahead and pass it over to our guests.
Thank you so much, Claudia, and thank you to the Housing Solutions Lab for hosting us. My name is Ashley Eberhart. I am, as Claudia said, the head of product at Unlock NYC. I will start our very brief presentation with a small overview of what the problem of source of income discrimination is, why we work on it, and a few of the programs that we work on at Unlock, and then hand it to Manon to talk specifically about how we use crowdsourced fair housing data in the fight against housing discrimination. So thank you all for being here. I wish I could see your faces, but looking forward to the Q&A. All right, at Unlock NYC, we build mobile tools that help New Yorkers who have housing vouchers record and report housing discrimination as they search for an apartment. I'll break that down on the next slide. Rental assistance vouchers, for anyone who's not familiar, they're really lifelines for thousands of families in New York City and millions of households nationwide. And they often create pathways from homelessness to housing because they subsidize the cost of a private rental on the private market. New York City residents are really lucky to be protected by both municipal and state law from being turned down from an apartment just because they use a voucher. But it does happen all the time. And I think that's something that across the country, we've heard stories that even though almost half of Americans who use rental assistance are protected by a law like this, and maybe that's true in the city that you're from as well, they are getting turned down and told no Section 8, no vouchers, no programs whenever they contact an apartment. So since around 2021, we have worked with nearly 1,000 tenants in New York City to collect about 2,500 allegations of unfair denials from all 5 boroughs in New York City, every city council district, private houses, medium-sized buildings, and some of the city's most notorious landlords. And so our belief is whether voucher holders are being explicitly denied a viewing or ghosted by a real estate agent, or just subjected to unlawful requirements that make it impossible to use their voucher, it's unjust, and we're working together as a community and using technology to speak up and hold bad actors accountable. Very briefly, some folks ask, why are housing vouchers so important? Of all of the topics in housing, and I know there are so many, why do we focus specifically on source of income discrimination? And I think one of the primary reasons is that when landlords and brokers discriminate against voucher holders, our homeless shelters stay full. In New York City, where we're mainly working right now, the average family with children spends over a year and a half in homeless shelter, and adult households 2 years, although we've seen much more than that. And that's despite the fact that many of them have vouchers in their hand that guarantee a landlord rent. The experience of being stigmatized with a housing voucher, I think it's impossible to overstate how big the toll is on the mental and emotional well-being of families when they know that every single time they pick up the phone, they're about to be discriminated against. So for lots of reasons, and with a record number of New York City residents in the shelter system, it's really, really vital that vouchers are able to do their job. So how are we doing this? At Unlock, we imagine a future with a fair housing search for all tenants. And to do that, we operate 3 programs in support of ending housing discrimination. We could talk about them forever, but I'll just give you a brief overview. The heart of our organization, kind of the spark that started all of this, is our Rights Recorder, which is a free and easy to use mobile app that helps tenants who have vouchers build a paper trail when they're facing discrimination. Hundreds of New Yorkers, we've had undergraduates in the CUNY system, we've had retirees who are looking for affordable senior housing, have successfully used Rights Recorder to capture evidence of housing discrimination, build a paper trail, and do something about it, even if the only piece of technology they have access to is their mobile phone. So at Unlock NYC, we really like to say justice looks a little different to everybody. Could we go one slide back, please? But reporting can give our tenants the option to mediate, investigate, or advocate. So what happens is once they use that web app that you saw on the previous slide, our intake team will review the report, adjust missing details and evidence, and then adds existing intel and data that we have about the real estate agent or landlord that's involved in the incident. And this helps us match the tenant up with one of our legal service providers who may then be able to get that tenant a fair chance to view and apply to the apartment or to participate in a larger investigation. The second program that we are really proud of is that by design, our team is majority led by New Yorkers who have experienced the voucher system firsthand. So half of our staff, 100% of our governing board have all actually used a voucher to find a home for their families. We've also developed a really unique governing board, which is called the Leadership Collective. And during their year-long term, they advise our team. They learn skills in advocacy and nonprofit management and conduct capstone projects. In addition, we provide different opportunities to stay involved, and a lot of that is in the systems change work that Manon will share in just a moment. And by reporting their experiences, I think, and this is where data comes in at its finest, Unlock users have created what we believe to be the largest crowdsourced data set of its kind, with thousands of allegations of fair housing violations against voucher holders. So I'm going to hand it to Manon to talk about how we use that data to shape the public narrative and to drive broad systems change.
Thank you so much, Ashley, and thank you all for being here today. We're so excited to be in conversation with you. So I'm going to do a deeper dive into our systems change program and specifically how we use data at Unlock NYC to fight source of income discrimination. So Ashley was just talking about our Rights Recorder app. Every time someone uses our Rights Recorder app to report source of income discrimination, we have a new data point, a new story that gives us a better understanding of the problem that we're trying to tackle. So when we were first building this app, we realized that if we made it easy, supportive, and worthwhile to report discrimination, more and more New Yorkers would take action to report, and over time, we would be building this really unique database of crowdsourced incidents about discrimination. And that was particularly important to us because when we first started doing this work in 2019, there was very, very little data available about this problem. So it was a little bit invisibilized. In terms of what we collect, so anytime someone uses our tool to file a report, they share some information about themselves, like what kind of voucher they have, what their household size is, and then they share information about the actual discriminatory incident that happened. So they'll tell us, when did it happen? Where did it happen? Is there a specific address that they, a listing that they had seen online and that they're trying to apply to? They will share information about the denial tactic. So for example, was it an explicit denial, or did the landlord use something like a credit score or an income requirement to turn them down? They can also upload evidence. So for example, a phone recording or a screenshot of an SMS or an email conversation. They can also share information about the broker that they were speaking to. And then we also make space to share a story. So a little bit more qualitative information about what happened. Because we have the address of most of the buildings that are reported, we're then able to link the data that is crowdsourced through our tool to open data available to New Yorkers. So depending where you are, you may or may not have access to a ton of open data, but we do have a really great open data law in New York City. So we have a ton of information about buildings in New York. So when someone reports an address, we can then link that and look at who owns that building. Have there been any evictions or violations at that property? What political and administrative boundaries does this building fall in? So for example, like which city council district is it in and who's the city council member that represents that area, which can be really useful for advocacy purposes. What it ends up looking at on the back end is something like this, right? Like it's rows and rows of data. We have almost 3,000 reports now in our database. So it's just like this massive database with something like that looks like this. So like a timestamp of when the person reported it, and then information about their voucher. I'm not showing you the whole thing because it has many, many columns, but just to give you a sense of like, someone sees the app on the front end, they report something, and then it lands in our database. And we kind of have to take this and try to tell a story through it. So how do we do that? So in order to make data actionable, you have to summarize it and try to tell a story, right? We have to try to find trends and patterns that we're gonna be able to paint a picture of this problem that's impacting our city. And at Unlock, we really believe that this process needs to be really collaborative. So we work really closely with our community partners, impacted New Yorkers, and collaborators throughout the whole research and data interpretation process. We believe that it's really subjective, right? So when you even decide like, what data am I going to collect? And then what does it mean? This is a really subjective process. So if it's just me doing it alone, I'm going to make sense of the data in a very different way than someone who's impacted by this problem, has lived experience, has gone through it. So we really try to do this in a really highly participatory manner from the initial, like, what are the questions we want to ask with this data, to the interpretation of it, to finally, like, how are we going to disseminate this into the public eye, and what kinds of policy recommendations do we want to make based on the findings in our data project. So over time, we have found that there's three main ways that we believe are really useful in terms of how we can use our data to support our fair housing movement. So the first is to enable data-driven fair housing investigations, and I will give examples of each of these. The second is to develop novel data and research products on source of income discrimination. And the third is to advocate for progressive policies to transform the voucher system. So to walk you through a few examples, in terms of enabling data-driven fair housing investigations, one example is that we used our crowdsourced data, and again, integrating it with property ownership information, we developed a serial discriminators list. So this is a list of landlords and brokers that have been reported to us more than 10 times by our community members. And we could have just released this list online, but again, thinking about how do we really leverage this to make a bigger splash and to, strengthen our movement as a whole, we collaborated with our movement partners, so community organizers, fair housing agencies, to release this data at a press conference in front of City Hall, where we really shared our policy recommendations for how do we crack down and actually enforce discrimination so that more people can unlock housing. When it comes to developing novel data and research on source of income discrimination, our big product here that we developed a few years ago is our interactive map of source of income discrimination in New York City. So again, this map is a visualization of our crowdsourced incidents that we have received to date. You can see on the left-hand side that when you're kind of zoomed out on the map, it aggregates the data at the city council district level. And then when you zoom in, which is what you see on the right, you can see more granular address level data, and it also gives you a breakdown of some of the most common discriminatory tactics we're seeing in different districts. This tool was really helpful for us in the early days to make the case that source of income discrimination is not a niche issue, right? It's happening in every single city council district, every borough. It's something that's impacting our city as a whole. And then when you look on the map at those darker areas where we're kind of seeing some hotspots, this map was really helpful to get, to help us build alliances with the elected officials that represent those districts and tell them like, hey, this is something that's happening in your district. It's super common. Do you want to partner with us? Do you want to champion this cause with us? And what the outcome was that we were able to, with the help of city council members who really advocated with us, we were able to get the city to invest millions of dollars into combating source of income discrimination from an enforcement perspective. More recently, we developed a research project that looked at new and evolving denial tactics on the rental market. So something we had noticed was when we started doing this work 5 years ago, it was a lot more common for landlords to say overtly discriminatory things like, no, I don't work with Section 8, I don't like vouchers. But over time, they have adapted their tactics and become more sophisticated to fly under the radar and evade enforcement. So this is something we wanted to take a look at, both to warn voucher holders of what to look out for and to inform enforcement agencies about these new tactics. And then lastly, I'm not going to go into detail about our policy platform. I'm sure we can talk about that more in the Q&A. But anytime we release this kind of data or research, we're always doing it in collaboration with our movement partners to try to elevate their demands. So for example, one of the things we're working on is trying to regulate corporate landlords, who are really the biggest drivers of this kind of discrimination, by increasing fines to be proportional to their portfolio size. Lastly, I just wanted to touch on the limitations of working with crowdsourced data. So, because this is people's stories that they are entrusting us with, we've had to be really careful and intentional about how we handle privacy, consent, and data security. We want to make sure we are the best stewards possible of this data that is entrusted to us. And we were really influenced by the consentful tech movement on that front. We also have to think about sample size and credibility. So there's over 900 New Yorkers have used this tool to report discrimination, but there's tens of thousands of voucher holders in New York City. So we do get questions sometimes about how representative is your sample? Is it credible? And then lastly, legal risks, because we are making accusations about serial discriminators. So we want to make sure we are protecting ourselves from potential defamation lawsuits and things like that. And with that, I will pass it back to Ashley to take us into the future and talk about our expansion project.
Hi, this is Ashley from the future. As Manon said, and as someone has actually already brought up in the Q&A section, we started to receive, I think from the very beginning, we started to receive reports from clients with vouchers across the US, as well as inquiries from places as close by as Westchester County in New York to as far away as Puerto Rico and San Francisco, saying we're really interested in this tool. How could we bring this to our jurisdiction? And so over the course of the last 6 months, we've been piloting our tools for the first time outside of New York City in a partnership with Housing Opportunities Made Equal and other implementing partners in Buffalo, New York. Over the course of July to November of this year, we enrolled 33 Section 8 voucher holders in Buffalo in this pilot project to use our Rights Recorder app. This was made possible with, the amazing support of housing mobility coaches at the community-based organization Home, which has been doing work in fair housing for decades, as well as enterprise community partners, the Poverty and Race Research Action Council, both of which served as advisors on the project and really linked us up with data and policy research around New York State. And then we also worked with an amazing data engineer and activist named Murray Cox from the Housing Justice Data Lab to tease out how difficult it is to figure out who owns a specific parcel of land based on an address in New York State. I'm just going to briefly touch on this because I think that we will dive in a little bit deeper on the findings of our pilot in the fireside chat. But in order to do this, we really looked at all of the different elements of our technology, our property ownership data, and our marketing materials that would need to change in order for us to go from this behemoth of New York City that we've been focusing on for the past 4 years into a new jurisdiction. So for this program, we designed some early new marketing materials, built a specific program dashboard for local implementing partners since we're not on the ground there, and then worked to scrape New York State property ownership data, which I know Manon will tell you about during the chat. And I would say, and again, we'll go deeper into this, but I think we learned some really important lessons about what it will take to bring Unlock to scale. And I think that was, those fell mainly into 4 areas. One was, in what ways do we need to make our technology more universal and adaptable to new jurisdictions? The second was, how do we enroll and engage clients in areas where we're not on the ground and we haven't yet built the trust and the reputation that we have in New York City? What types of resources do mobility coaches, housing specialists, and other housing advocates need in order to spread the word about Unlock and be able to successfully use that with their clients? And then lastly, what does it take, both statewide and nationwide, to know who are the property owners often hiding behind a variety of LLCs? So we will chat a little bit further about this, but we also have an expansion survey that we developed. It's very simple. If you want to keep in touch with us as we expand, if you have ideas or feedback and would like to have a conversation with our team, please fill out the survey. We have a QR code, and then in just a minute, I will also share the survey link in the chat for you. And then in terms of other ways that you might want to join our movement, some ways to stay involved or to stay in touch with us. We are on social media, currently Instagram, Facebook, X/Twitter, and TikTok. And our handle is @WeUnlockNYC for all of those. We have a beautiful Giving Tuesday campaign up. I would encourage you to check it out on Twitter, even if you're not in a position or interested in donating, but we do also have a link to our donate page given the timing of the holiday season. And then lastly, if you go to our website on our homepage and scroll all the way down, we do have a mailing list, and we send out an email approximately monthly with stories and learnings from our work. I think that's it. Thank you, and I'm going to turn it back over to Claudia for the fireside chat.
All right. Well, this is just a dream of applied and participatory research. And I know people are very excited to talk about it. I'm seeing lots of questions in the Q&A. Folks, keep putting your questions in there. I know Ashley has been busily typing away answers, but we'll also get to some of them live. So definitely encourage and invite you to put your questions there. I'm going to monopolize for just a little bit longer to ask some of my questions, but definitely we'll leave time. So Ashley, let me ask you first to tell us just a little bit more about what inspired Unlock NYC? What was the original impetus and motivation? And then what inspired you to move outside of New York City as well?
Yeah, we always love a little history. So in the summer of 2019, the co-founders of Unlock met at a social impact and technology incubator called Blue Ridge Labs in Brooklyn, New York. We had the immense honor of being brought together in a small cohort of activists and organizers, experts in the topic of housing, and expert defined in very broad terms, software engineers, product managers, and designers. And over the course of a summer, I think we had about 4 months, we talked to about 150 New Yorkers about the barriers that they were facing in identifying, securing, and staying in safe and affordable housing. And I came in with a public health and design background. I did not come in with a housing background. I had done some projects in public health that all came down to safe housing would have prevented this public health crisis. And I had never heard of a housing voucher, but it seemed like every time we started a conversation, no matter where the conversation started, someone would say, you really need to be thinking about housing vouchers. I have one. I've had one for 2 years. I've been stuck in shelter. Child Protective Services took my kids away and they told me that I couldn't have them back until I found an apartment. But every single time I pick up the phone, I get hung up on, I get harassed, I get told no, I get ghosted. So that was really the impetus for building our initial prototype. And it kind of took off from there. We really we wanted to see, this is getting long, but I would say, there was a wonderful community partner named Neighbors Together, and they were already recording and reporting source of income discrimination data on their own as a grassroots organization. And we sat side by side in a conference room with them twice a week for a few months to see what they were doing, how they were doing it, and asking them, how could we make this easier for you with technology?
Got it. Yeah, that's really helpful. And I want to ask you, Manon, about how you've been leveraging these data to, you mentioned identifying certain denial tactics, really listing who are the worst offenders, identifying areas that have particularly high rates of discrimination. How are you then harnessing those or thinking about how those could inform policy?
Absolutely. So I can give a few examples from our most recent project on denial tactics. What became super clear, we were looking at denial tactics and also segmenting it by portfolio size to see like are larger landlords discriminating in a different way than say like a small mom and pop landlord. And what we found is that small mom and pop landlords tend to incriminate themselves much more like explicitly. So they will say things like, oh no, I don't take Section 8, while the big corporate landlords are much more sophisticated and have developed other ways to turn down voucher holders without saying we don't take vouchers. So for example, imposing really strict income requirements, like saying you have to make 40 times the rent in order to live here, or using credit scores or other tactics that might be a little more difficult to identify. And we also found that in the overall share of our crowdsourced data, it was really the largest proportion represented in our database was big corporate landlords. So the landlords in New York City that are driving source of income discrimination and perpetuating homelessness and segregating neighborhoods are not so much the small mom and pop landlords, like although there are some discriminatory mom and pop landlords, but the really largest share of landlords in our database was landlords who own between 20 to 60 buildings or more than 60 buildings. And so what that means from a policy perspective is that we really think we should focus on trying to regulate some of these larger corporate landlords. And so one of the ways we can do that is by saying, okay, well, when you get a fine for discriminating against a voucher holder, it should be tied to your portfolio size, because something that's going to feel really like a fine that's going to feel really meaningful to an individual landlord is going to feel like a slap on the wrist to a giant private equity firm with millions and millions of dollars in assets. So that's one big thing. And then we were also, in collaboration with Neighbors Together, who is our main community partner, who's done a ton of thinking about this, thinking about what are other ways we can hit these big corporate landlords in the pocket where it hurts. So for example, revoking access to tax breaks and public subsidies if a landlord is found to have discriminated against voucher holders. So that's one example of somewhere where the research finding is helping support policy campaigns.
Yeah, that's great. That's really helpful. So I'm going to ask one more question before we turn to the Q&A. And it's for you, Ashley, and it's kind of a catch-all, but I want to ask you more about the Buffalo pilot. And obviously, Buffalo is very different than New York City, I'm sure, in a bunch of ways. Maybe not just in terms of how the voucher program is structured, but also the housing market, your presence on the ground. How did those differences shape how the pilot rolled out and what you've learned?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I know you just saw the 20-page memo I wrote on this topic, but I think the bottom line is that we learned a lot about what it takes to bring our tools to another jurisdiction. And as I said, some of those were technology based and just realizing where we needed to make tweaks to the tech. But I think a lot of them were figuring out what does it take to build trust and to build the word of mouth, especially that's been really, really key to our success in New York City. I think, as I said, in our early days, we got our first users by literally sitting side by side with them in a conference room for 2 hours on Tuesdays and Fridays. How do we do the same thing as we're expanding to places that we don't have an on-the-ground presence? There were also some really interesting regional, just very practical regional and local variations. There were some, for example, City FEPS, which is a city-based voucher program, is what we work with mainly in New York City. That has very different rules and regulations and limits and expiry dates than a Section 8 voucher in upstate New York. Some of it was terminology. Nobody uses the phrase HCV for housing choice voucher in New York City, but it's much, much more common up in that region. So how do you make those tweaks and learn about them? And then another one that we found was just access to Wi-Fi. I think, in a large city like New York, a lot of the shelters might not have Wi-Fi, but there might be a Burger King around the corner, a Starbucks around the corner that does. Whereas in Buffalo, some people were not using the web app as much because they were situated in a motel that was 2 buses outside of the nearest free Wi-Fi spot. So I think those practical variations, it kind of indicates to us that we need to do more user research upfront and more relationship building upfront with the ecosystem on the ground to really understand those. And then also just remembering that it takes time. I think we did a lot of our expectations for the Buffalo pilot were based on where we are at this mature state in New York City, which, by the way, is a huge city. So even if a tiny, tiny fraction of voucher holders report, it's very easy to get to 1,000 users. But I think, in the very beginning, it did take time. And then we need to bake that into future jurisdictions and be, kind of just have some patience around the process.
Totally. Yeah. And I know this came up a little earlier too, but also a different data landscape, right? So it's not New York City in terms of the property data, and that comes with its own challenges as well. But now I want to turn to, we're getting lots of great questions, and folks keep putting them in there. I see one recurring question kind of around whether people can currently use the app to report other kinds of discrimination beyond source of income, whether you'd be interested or think there would be challenges around expanding to that kind of discrimination reporting.
Yeah, and Ashley, I'm happy to take a stab at this one and then feel free to jump in. So it's definitely something we've talked about, and we have gotten interest from, for example, the Fair Chance Coalition in New York. So this is a new law that is going into effect in January 1st, actually, which is really exciting, that bans landlords from discriminating against folks who have criminal records or criminal backgrounds. And we were asked like, oh, could you expand your tool to meet this need and document this kind of discrimination? And, we are a 4-person team, so we have to be really intentional and careful about what we say yes to. So for now, we've been focused on expanding our tool to new geographies. So really looking at upstate, and remaining focused on source of income. That being said, we're definitely interested in those other protected classes because we know that discrimination is intersectional, right? We know that someone who has a voucher is also probably a person of color. A lot of the users who use our tool are women. We know that there's an intersection with the disability as well. So in the meantime, since we don't have time to adapt our tool to address all these different protected classes, we're actually just starting a new research study that's going to be focusing on demographics. So understanding our user base better and seeing, how through, distributing a survey, understanding how people identify and is there crossover between these different classes.
Got it. Yep. I see another question in here that I thought was really interesting, and I see it's been answered, but want to give you a chance to expand live if you want to. It's from Sarah. She was interested in a particular tactic. The unit is no longer available, basically, or ghosting. How do you tell people to respond to this? How could renters fight back if they're told the unit is just no longer available?
Yeah, so that was something that came out in our denial tactics report. It was super common for people to be told unit is no longer available. And as you may know, we're in a housing supply crunch in New York City. We have very little vacant housing and especially housing under $2,400 a month. I think it's less than 1.5%. So sometimes when people are told unit is no longer available, it could be that the unit was rented out. So the way that we encourage people to test if they are in fact being, told the truth or being lied to is to conduct a comparator test. So that means that, if I'm a voucher holder and I applied for an apartment and the broker either ghosted me or told me the unit was no longer available, I could get my friend Ashley or an advocate, or even we have tenants who create an alternative phone number through like a burner phone app, and you contact the broker again, but you pose as a high income tenant and you see if you get a viewing. And very often, the voucher holder was told the unit is no longer available. And then when they reach out as a high income tenant, it's like, oh, we're having an open house tomorrow. Why don't you come in? So if you have evidence that there's differential treatment based on your income, that can be used as evidence to show that it was in fact discrimination.
Got it. Great. Here's another good question, I think, from Rebecca. She wants to know if Unlock NYC envisions engaging with property owners or property management at all. Is there any potential there to drive change, or are they really, knowingly causing harm? Yeah, any thoughts?
Ashley, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, I can take this one. Yeah, I think it's a great question. I see really kind of two parts to that. I want to address the second part first. This idea of are they always knowingly causing harm? And I would say in our experience, the answer is no, not always. The law. I want to just kind of float that the law is very complicated, and some people actually just don't know. And what we always say is one of the reasons that reporting is so powerful is that it is a vehicle for education of property management companies and owners. So when we link up somebody who reports an incident that is discriminatory to a legal service provider, so in New York City, we work really closely with the New York City Commission on Human Rights. The first thing they do is try to get to the bottom of what happened. And they often are able to give that property owner the chance to do the right thing if it was truly something that they did unintentionally. So I think, the first thing we always tell people is we don't just go around suing everybody. There is always the opportunity to say, oh, I didn't understand that. Let's have a do-over. The second is, I think as Manon said, we are a small team and we want to be really conscious of scope creep. That's not the part of the movement that we're really focused on, but there are some really interesting models out there. A couple that come to mind to me are Brilliant Corners in the Bay Area, as well as Anthos Home, which is a newer organization based on that model that's in New York, who have models that are based on let's link up with property owners who do want to work with vouchers and make the process more streamlined for them. So I think there's a lot of cool stuff going on in that area. It is not our focus as a tenant-based organization.
Gotcha. So I know we often have a lot of local officials and staff from across the country on these calls. I wonder if you have any advice for other jurisdictions that might be interested in doing something like this, but wouldn't yet have access to your technology, and particularly if those places don't have source of income protections. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you could actually, if you're in a place that doesn't have source of income protections, you could still create a really simple way to collect this data to then make the case that your city or county or state needs source of income discrimination protections. So one way to do that without having access to a fancy interactive chatbot is to just create a Google form. That's actually what our partner organization Neighbors Together was doing. And then we built the chatbot based on the inspiration we got from their Google form. So that can be something that, direct service providers or community-based organizations might use if they are serving tenants who have vouchers and say, oh, okay, you're experiencing this. For now, this isn't something that is illegal here, but we're actually using this really simple form where you can collect your experiences so that over time we can show that this is something that happens all the time and that's preventing people from accessing housing. So that would be my
Yeah.
recommendation.
Do you want to add anything, Ashley?
No, I think Manon answered that perfectly.
Okay, great. I see a question here from my colleague, Tony. He wants to know if you see Unlock NYC or the app expanding towards proactive outreach to voucher holders to increase your sample and generalizability, or maybe that's something you already do.
What do you mean by proactive outreach exactly?
Yeah. Tony, do you want to expand in the chat at all? I can imagine that he might have in mind, for example, um, partnering with NYCHA to get folks who are newly accessing vouchers, training on how to use the app or something like that.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
can speak to your partnership network if that's helpful. So we do work with a number of agencies that administer vouchers. So the biggest one that we work with in New York City is Canva, which administers vouchers all over Brooklyn. But also many of the major voucher administrating programs already are passing out our educational booklets, telling people about Unlock on day one of their housing search with a voucher. And in addition, we work with about 60 community-based organizations in New York City. And one thing that we have been trying to do very mindfully is make sure that, especially on the community-based relationships, we're finding all of the different ties to demographics that may be impacted by source of income discrimination differently. So for instance, we work with a number of organizations that specifically serve domestic violence survivors. We have a few organizations that work with immigrant communities. And I think a lot of I don't know if we've mentioned this yet, but Manon and the systems change team are embarking on a demographic study right now to really understand the demographics and the ways that SOI doesn't exist in a vacuum, and it does intersect with a lot of other protected classes. And I think that's going to go a long way in making sure that we're proactively recruiting organizations that help us have a representative sample of all of the different ways and all the different identities you can hold while having a voucher.
Got it. So I think we might have time for maybe one more question. I'm gonna, yeah, take my prerogative again and ask one that occurred to me. I was really interested to hear about kind of the way you involve people with lived experience in both shaping your research questions and interpreting your data. I wonder if you could just tell us more about that.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to talk more about that. So, um, we're actually trying this year, we're trying something new where we have a really structured steering committee for our research program. So we recruited 5 members of our leadership collective program. So this is like an advisory board we run every year with opportunities from people who have reported discrimination through our tool to be part of our strategic planning and things like that. And we offer opportunities to alumni who have participated in the program. So we reached out to alums. We're like, we're embarking on this new project to study demographics and intersectionality. Would you like to join our participatory action research committee? And so we vetted folks, we reviewed their applications, and now we have a committee we're meeting with on a monthly basis to really go through the entire research process together, from shaping research questions to developing, a data collection strategy to then interpreting the data and then disseminating it at the end, and brainstorming policy recommendations and things like that. I think in terms of data interpretation, what I have found really useful is to start from a place of what is data, because there is a digital divide, and that can be a bit intimidating for folks. So just breaking it down to just data is just bits of information. People use data in their everyday life, whether it's like the weather app or what they're finding on Google, so really making it more accessible in that way so that it's not like something scary and intimidating that only quote unquote researchers know how to do, but really doing some popular education around that and then inviting people to feel empowered to be a part of that process.
Got it. Well, this has been terrific. I really just can't thank you enough. If folks want to get in touch with Manon and Ashley, we'll be sharing their slides with their contact information. You can go on their website or reach out to me. I'll be happy to connect you. We'll be posting a recording of this on our website and look forward to sharing that with you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. And thank you, Claudia, for having us.